Hey everybody, Jake here at TrendSpider to go over the markets after the first full week of an incredibly volatile start to May. And what we'll do is we'll go over the broad markets, some crypto, and some individual names to end this video. And starting with the S&P 500 ETF SPY, you can see here that we did actually have a decent bounce off the support zone on Friday after just a brutal two-day sell-off into the end of the week after just a massive move on Wednesday. So all in all, just not only day-to-day volatility, but also intraday volatility really was the theme of this week and the start of May. Now on the weekly chart, this is where it gets a little intriguing. So one, the last time that we had a blue raindrop was near the top here. Back in 2021. So what's really interesting is we have not had a blue raindrop yet. We had one last week, so that's number one. Two, this week actually closed as a red week if you look at the just regular hollow candle, but we actually closed as a green raindrop. So there is a little bit of divergence here where you have a red close but a green raindrop. So the fact that we had the blue raindrop and then a green raindrop this week, even though we closed red on the hollow candle, definitely is something to keep in mind going into the week ahead and possibly maybe starting to show signs of a potential short-term bottom, but price action as always will determine that. Now going into the next one, we have the Qs here. We have what's looking more like a falling wedge here on the daily than what it looked like on the S&P 500 SPY ETF. But you can see here that we did actually hold the support zone here as well. And we'll have to see if that area holds. If not, we do have an area below here. Let's call it right around 298 or so. Which is just a previous low here that we experienced back in March of 2021. Now, what's interesting is you actually have another area here, a horizontal level on the weekly chart that actually is right around that area as well. Let's call it from around 293 to around 298 below. And so if we do continue down after literally, this is the fifth red week in a row, this is definitely an area that you may want to keep an eye on. Not only is it just right under a psychological level, which is the 300 mark, but it is a previous area that acted as resistance back in 2020 and then support back in 2021. So all in all, we'll have to see what happens next week. And at the end of the day, this market has been incredibly unpredictable, and you really have to take this market almost by every hour at this point. If you look at IWM, small caps, you will see a pretty similar setup here. You've got this falling wedge here on the daily chart. We closed literally right at this support line. We'll call it support line because it held, but it did undercut this support line during the day. So intraday we broke through it, but we closed literally right at it to end the day on Friday. And what's interesting is you do have a gap below right around 178. So you can see if we look to the left, we do have our next level below is that gap. And I'm pretty positive a lot of people are watching that to see if that fills going into the week ahead. Now on the weekly chart, you can see we've got the COVID low and the all-time high anchored VWAP here. We had an anchored VWAP pinch forming, but then we did break down through that last week, and then we closed below it again this week. And you do actually have this gap below on the weekly chart around 165. So this gap below on the daily is the first one you're going to want to watch right around 178. If that breaks, then you do have this big weekly gap below around 165. So those are kind of your levels to watch above. If we do get a bounce here, your support zone, your resistance zone on the falling wedge is in the mid to upper 190s. Going into Bitcoin, which is generally a great area to look at risk on, risk off kind of sentiment in the market. We had a really interesting SR flip here during the week. So what do I mean by that? You can see this green area is where price respected this area. It bounced at least short term. And then finally we broke down through it last week. And you can see here that essentially we retested this area twice. It acted as resistance, so it turned from support to resistance. That's where you get the SR flip name. And we did continue to hit new lows today on Friday. Now, the weekly candle doesn't close until Sunday, so keep that in mind. A lot can happen over the weekend, especially when you're talking about crypto. But if we do continue down this previous low from February 23rd, right around 34,300, and let's call it 34.3 to around 34.6 is what an area that I'd probably be watching for below if we do continue to move down. That may be an area to get at least a short-term bounce simply because this was your previous low from the 23rd of February. But we'll kind of see what price action has for us over the weekend. Now, on the weekly chart, you can see here that we do have a pretty defined symmetrical triangle forming here. You can see we have the COVID low VWAP, and it also has a 12.5% offset, meaning I essentially added another VWAP 12.5% above that one. And you'll see here that I added that because there's multiple instances where the price action respected that general area. Now, the actual COVID low VWAP is way down here around 32,900. But with Bitcoin, I'm just going to call it 32.5 all the way to 33K if we do start to break down through this symmetrical triangle. Now, if we break down through the COVID low VWAP, that's when things get very interesting because we really haven't had that issue pretty much since COVID. So if we start breaking below that VWAP that started during COVID, that is going to definitely change the status quo here in the market, and we could see some more selling pressure going into the week ahead, especially for the equities markets as they generally follow Bitcoin's risk on, risk off type of, I'm going to call it an indicator at this point. Now, Ethereum looking pretty similar. What's really interesting about Ethereum is we're really nowhere near the COVID low VWAP. So if you look at the daily chart, we have this previous support zone. Same thing that we saw in Bitcoin acting as resistance and then hitting new lows as we get into today on Friday. And if we do continue to break down, you've got a pretty basic just horizontal level here below these two pivots right around, let's say 2,500, 2,400 to 2,600 is what I'm going to call it. And that would be an area that we've tested before. Just because we've tested it doesn't mean it's going to hold, but I think a lot of people would be watching that area below as a potential bounce area. Now, on the weekly chart, we have a similar symmetrical triangle formation here. You can see that we're pretty much about to break down below it if we get that weekly close, which closes on Sunday. But if we do break down, the COVID low is way down here around 1,900. I'm just going to call it 1,700 to 1,900 below. You can have some huge ranges on these capitulation candles from liquidation in the crypto market. So if we do break down, you may see a really big red candle breaking down to the COVID low VWAP. But that is to be determined, and we will let price action lead the way with really any of these charts. That's the way to do it. Now, going into ENPH, this is one that actually closed green on the week. Not so much the last 2 days of the trading week, but it did close as a green candle here for the weekly close. And it actually looks relatively similar to Bitcoin and Ethereum, where you've got this symmetrical triangle here on the weekly chart. You can see that we've bounced at this area a couple times. We bounced off of it from last week and continued to make a new high this week before having a pretty sharp sell-off towards the end of the week. However, if we do start to see some selling pressure and a breakdown below this symmetrical triangle support, we may be retesting the COVID low VWAP, which we did test back in January of 2022, which at this point was around 115. Now, this has moved up a little bit. The VWAP is going to continue to move up if price is trading above it. So that is now around 120, give or take $1 or $2. So that would definitely be the area to watch. If we do continue to move up next week, you'll see here, let's say around 200 to 205 would be an area to watch above if this does get some steam. But this is one that has actually done pretty well for the 2022 year so far, unlike a lot of names out there. But we'll just see if this holds. If not, I would definitely look for the COVID low VWAP around 118 to, let's say, 122 below to kind of watch. Now, going into UPST, this is one that has a pretty defined descending triangle here. So we've got this descending resistance zone. You can see that we've got this horizontal zone highlighted in green, and we're getting pretty close to the apex of this pattern. So we're either going to break up or break down, and that the apex of this pattern is right near the beginning of June. So definitely getting close to a make or break on UPST. And as I mentioned before, no one has a crystal ball. If they tell you they know what's going to happen to any of these charts before they happen, then they're just lying. You just have to let price action determine which way these patterns are going to break. On the weekly chart, you can see here that I guess we could call this kind of a falling wedge on the weekly. A decent weekly candle here, actually. And if you turn on the raindrop, you'll see that there's a lot of volume at the top of the range. And remember, if you do want to try these raindrops, or you want to try any of these features that we go over on TrendSpider, we do have a 7-day free trial that you can give it a shot and see if it's something that works within your strategy and in your process and in analyzing the markets. But all in all, this is a pretty clean falling wedge here on UPST. And if we do continue up next week, let's call it the psychological level around 100, which also coincides with this resistance zone above. And as I mentioned, if we break, let's say around 71.50 to the downside through this descending triangle, that's when things could definitely get interesting. But that would be your downside level to watch below if we do continue to move down. And then if that breaks, then you kind of have to reevaluate things from there. Going into XOM, another one that had a really strong week, which is never a great thing if oil continues to just move up. You can see we've got the start of this ascending triangle here. You've got this previous high back from March. You've retested a couple days in a row this week. And, the thing about these patterns is you could literally have something like this, and this thing could literally trade, up or down for the next couple months. So all in all, a pretty strong candle for the daily on XOM. And you can see here, this is an inside bar. So we'll see how that plays out going into next week. And if you look at the weekly chart, we have this huge ascending wedge here that we are starting to get close to this resistance zone above. So we may have a little more room to move up, but then things start to get a little interesting. But ascending wedges are not always bullish. A lot of people think they do have a bearish bias, which a lot of the time that's the case, but that does not mean that these can't break to the upside. So keep in mind, going into next week, you can draw this ascending triangle on your own on TrendSpider. It's essentially just connecting the June 8th, 2020 highs to this January 2022 low, and then the high from March 7th, 2022 that week. And that's how you can create this zone. So definitely keep an eye on this, and we'll see how things go into the week ahead. Now, if you don't want to use zones and you want to simply just use a trend line but still have some margin of error, you can connect this line here to this wick here that I just mentioned. But instead of using the zone, you can create an alert and add that sensitivity around it, and it essentially creates its own zone from there. So definitely keep an eye on that going into the week ahead. But all in all, a really strong week for XOM. Next one is BABA. BABA is one that has a pretty defined symmetrical triangle here. You can see here that we did have a pretty hard rejection at the swing low VWAP. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm starting the volume weighted average price from this low on March 15th. And you can see that we rejected multiple times this week before just really taking a huge hit towards the end of the week. But this definitely was an area of interest to hold, and it did not. We broke below it, we broke right at it to the downside and filled that gap from the April 29th gap up. And until we kind of break out of the symmetrical triangle, definitely keep an eye on this particular setup going into the week ahead. Now, on the weekly side of things, you'll see here that we do have this really just broadening wedge here. So for now, we're kind of trading in the middle of it, which is never something that you want to trade within. This could easily go way down or way up from here. So when you're trading in the middle of this type of setup, sometimes the best trade is just not to take one and see, which level this gets to. But everyone's different. That's just something to keep in mind, that a lot of the time you're taking a pretty big gamble when it's trading within this big of a range. Last one that we'll go over is SQ. This one actually had a decent comeback today on Friday. You can see here that we do have a symmetrical triangle here as well. Your starting point is pretty much just from your COVID low, and then connecting that to the February 2022 low. And then you can see here today that we had a decent hammer on Friday, and intraday undercut that trend zone, but did actually ended up closing above it and possibly a decent setup going into the week ahead if this can get some traction and close above, let's say, around 104. Now, on the weekly chart, you can see this really long-term uptrend pretty much starting from 2016. We do have a little more room to move down. That would be, let's say, in the mid to upper 70s below if we do continue down and retest that area. And at that point, I wouldn't say, the green does not necessarily mean buy. It just means that in the past, this has acted as a bounce zone. With this type of candle, maybe buyers are starting to come in and sellers are starting to exhaust. But as always, we would need to let price action determine that. You can see here that maybe we've got a very, very rough double W bottom trying to form here. But we'll see how next week goes and go from there. But your upside target, if we do continue to move up, would be around 120 or so, give or take how long this takes. If we move straight up next week on Monday, 125 would be your area. If it took a few days, this is a function of time. So if this took another month, we'd be looking at 115 as your resistance zone above. So just remember with diagonal trend lines, that's how you have to look at the market. They do change as time goes by. But all in all, as I mentioned, upside, let's call it 115 to 120. Downside, the support zone or previous support zone to potentially be support again would be in the mid 70s. So all in all, that is what we have for this weekend. I hope this weekend video was helpful and it gave you another perspective in the markets, as well as got a better idea of how you can use TrendSpider to really look at the markets in a more efficient and optimized perspective. And I hope everybody has a great weekend and a good week to start the second week of May. And remember, if you do enjoy these videos, please like and subscribe. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. Next week, we'll be at the FinTwit conference in Las Vegas. There still are tickets available if you want to go to the FinTwit 2022 Twitter page to check it out. Just at FinTwit 2022 is where you can check that out. And if I did get that handle wrong, you can always just go to Jonah Lupton's account, and he has been posting about it quite a bit. It will be hosted by him as well as Benzinga, and it should be a great time, and we hope to see you out there. And we'll talk to you guys soon.